Directly to the east of Toronto was the city of Scarborough, Ontario. In 1998, it was annexed into Toronto, but in 1987, it was its own municipality. In the early hours of September 29th, a 15-year-old living in the Guildwood neighborhood was asleep when a man broke into her home. The man pointed a knife at her and put his hand over her mouth as he attempted to rape her. The commotion within the room attracted the girl's mother, who opened the door and shrieked at the sight of the man. As he fled, the mother was able to catch a glimpse of him. He was a young white male, 6 feet tall, with blonde hair, blue eyes, and a baby face. He jumped out the window, ran to his white sedan, and drove away. The assault was reported to the police, and the mother was determined to have her daughter's attacker identified. She wasn't the only victim, after all. In the past several months, at least 3 other rapes or attempted rapes had occurred in Scarborough, 2 in May and 1 in July. All had occurred in the early morning hours and all involved the same perpetrator. The mother conducted her own search for a suspect. She learned that around the time of the assault, a roofing company had been working in the area. She called them and asked if any of their employees fit the description of her daughter's attacker. As it turned out, one did. His name was Anthony Hainmayer. Anthony was a 19-year-old from Newmarket, a city 45 kilometers north of Toronto. He was a former roofing employee who had quit his job 5 days before the assault. He did not own a white sedan like the rapist did, but it was possible he borrowed it or stole it. The mother brought this information to the police, and upon being given a photo lineup, she positively identified Anthony as the man she saw on September 29th. And so, 2 months after the attack, Anthony was arrested. He proclaimed his innocence but was charged with the crime. At his trial in 1989, Anthony pleaded innocent and faced up to a decade in prison if found guilty. His lawyer advised him to plead guilty instead and serve only 2 years. Anthony begrudgingly took the offer and served 16 months in prison. Despite the mother's insistence that he was the perpetrator, Anthony was completely innocent, because even after his arrest, the attacks in Scarborough continued. 2 assaults occurred in December of 1987, one on the 16th, and another just 1 week later. The attacks continued into the following year, with an assault on April 18, 1988. Realizing the dire problem on their hands, Toronto police began warning people of a rapist in the area. The police formed a task force dedicated to capturing the perpetrator once and for all. There was a common trend among the victims. Many had gotten off the bus just prior to being attacked, meaning they had likely been followed home. So, hoping the rapist would continue with this MO, the officers began staking out several bus stops throughout the city. On May 25, 1988, one of these officers lay in wait in a bus shelter when they noticed in the distance a man hiding behind a tree, watching people board and exit the bus. When the officer approached the man, he began to flee, prompting a short chase that, unfortunately, ended with the man getting away. Apparently spooked by the increased police presence, the rapist chose to strike elsewhere. 5 days after the incident, an attack occurred in Mississauga, about 30 kilometers away from Scarborough. No attacks occurred that summer, but they resumed in the fall. On October 4th, a woman fought against the rapist and was stabbed twice. A 10th attack occurred on November 16th, and an 11th attack 2 days after Christmas. In the latter instance, the rapist was chased off by a neighbor. Within the next year, 1989, 4 more attacks would occur. One in June, where the rapist was again chased away by neighbors, one in August, another in November, and in typical fashion, another attack around Christmas time. The 16th and final attack occurred on May 26, 1990, 3 years after the beginning of the Scarborough rapist's crime spree. The 19-year-old victim in this case was able to give a detailed description of her attacker, something the police were desperate for at this point. The description matched the one given by the mother in 1987. White male, blonde hair, blue eyes, around 6 feet tall. The police then utilized 2 relatively new tools, computer composites and DNA. With the victim's description, a detailed image was generated and was published in local newspapers. They then went about testing DNA samples collected from over 100 people to see if any were a match to the rapist's DNA. Shortly after the publication of the composite, 2 tips rolled in that repeated the same name: Paul Bernardo. Paul Kenneth Bernardo was born on August 27, 1964, in Ontario, Canada. He was the child of Marilyn Bernardo and an unknown father, though his legal father is listed as Kenneth Bernardo. Paul's status as a bastard child was unknown to him until his teens. He had 2 older siblings, Debbie and David. The Bernardos were a moderately wealthy family, but they were quite troubled. Kenneth and Marilyn would often be heard yelling at each other or at their children, and the family's reputation was tarnished by Kenneth's proclivities. He often spent his nights peeping throughout the neighborhood, and this escalated in 1975 when he was charged with child molestation. Marilyn was horrified at her husband's actions, and their arguments grew more tense as she gradually receded from the family. Paul's turbulent home life undoubtedly had an effect on him psychologically, but he maintained an affable facade, being well liked in school and dating a number of classmates. He graduated from high school in 1982 and followed in his disgraced father's footsteps by becoming an accountant. He studied at the University of Toronto, Scarborough, coincidentally at the same time as another Canadian serial killer, Russell Williams. Paul continued to date numerous women, all of whom broke off their relationships not long after they began. Though Paul seemed magnetic at first, the women soon discovered that he was very manipulative and downright abusive. It's a good thing they all left him when they did, but there was one woman who did not, one woman who submitted to all his demands. Karla Homolka was born on May 4, 1970, in Mississauga, Ontario. She was the child of Carol Homolka and Dorothy Homolka, and she would have 2 younger siblings, Lori and Tammy. Karla's upbringing was pretty normal, but even since she was little, she was an odd character. She had a habit of lying, escaping into fantasy, and remained somewhat infantile into her teen years. Like Paul, she dated numerous people during high school, and these relationships were short-lived. One thing remained consistent with Karla. She had a love for animals and aspired to be a veterinarian. In October of 1987, she and a close friend attended a pet convention at the Howard Johnson's Hotel in Scarborough. While eating at the hotel's cafe, Karla was approached by a man several years her senior. It was Paul Bernardo. The two hit it off immediately and began dating.
Okay, let's see what's up. We have the television and we have Karla drinking. Do you like those? They're good, eh?
The Homolka family, who lived about an hour from Toronto in St. Catharines, very much enjoyed Paul's presence, and by 1989, Paul and Karla were officially engaged. On the outside, the two certainly seemed like a perfect couple, and over the years, their relationship showed no signs of wear and tear. But that's part of why this case is so disturbing, the ability of the two to maintain appearances. They showed no signs of trouble, but were nonetheless cold-hearted people inside. While not at all a defense of her later actions, it could be said that Karla was somewhat brainwashed by the manipulative Paul. It was apparent just how much control he had over her life. Paul brought in decent money from his accounting work, but he eventually lost this position. He resorted to buying cheap cigarettes in Buffalo, New York, and smuggling them across the border to sell in the Golden Horseshoe. Despite losing his day job, Paul continued to maintain the facade for the Bernardos and the Homolkas, something that became especially important when people started to suspect he was the Scarborough rapist. Unfortunately for Paul, the police composite was a pretty good match to his visage. On November 20th, 1990, several months after the tips were first submitted, Paul was finally called in for questioning. The tipster in this case was the wife of one of Paul's friends. Though his genial facade fooled many, it apparently didn't fool her. However, after the interrogation with Paul, the police apparently found him more credible, mainly because his coherence and confidence was more convincing than the somewhat awkward and less coherent accuser. He did provide blood and saliva samples, but as the police no longer considered him a suspect, these samples were not immediately tested. Had they done so, they would have discovered that Paul was indeed the Scarborough rapist. Thanks to the increased police scrutiny, Paul had ceased his activities in Scarborough, but he didn't stop assaulting people altogether. Instead, he moved his hunting grounds closer to Karla in St. Catharines. As Karla gradually became aware of Paul's proclivities, she became an active participant, and the first target of the couple was Karla's own sister. Tammy Lynn Homolka was an athletic 15-year-old who Paul greatly admired. At times, it seemed he was more attracted to her than to Karla. He became fixated on taking her virginity, and he proposed the idea to Karla that they drug and rape her. Karla claims she protested at first, but eventually agreed. In September of 1990, while working at a vet clinic, she stole a bottle of the anesthetic halothane for later use on Tammy. Her intention was to let Paul assault her sister as a Christmas gift. On the night of December 23, 1990, Paul and Karla offered an eggnog and rum concoction to Tammy. Unbeknownst to her, they had crushed halcyon pills and poured them in the drink. Within time, Tammy became unconscious, and to ensure she remained that way, Paul and Karla doused a cloth with the halothane they had stolen and placed it under her nose. They dragged Tammy down to the basement, where the two set up a camera and filmed themselves assaulting the 15-year-old. But at some point, Tammy began to gag and started to suffocate on her own vomit. They attempted to revive her with no immediate success. They pulled her up into her bedroom, hid the camera and the cloth, and redressed her. They quickly came up with a cover story, then called 911. She was rushed to St. Catharines General Hospital, but it was too late. Paul and Karla had killed Tammy Homolka. Tammy died with large burns on her face from the halothane. When asked about it, Paul and Karla claimed it was rug burn which was inflicted on her when they tended to her unconscious body. Despite the fact that this does not look like rug burn, the doctors believed them and ruled her death accidental. The Homolka family spent the worst Christmas of their lives arranging Tammy's funeral. Paul and Karla feigned shock and sadness, but hid their complete lack of remorse within. At Tammy's funeral on December 27th, Paul had allegedly been caught leering at and caressing the young girl's body. When no one was looking, he and Karla surreptitiously placed a photo of themselves in her coffin, as well as notes expressing their supposed sorrow. This wasn't discovered until her body was exhumed 2 years later. In early 1991, Paul and Karla packed up their things and moved out of their parents' homes. They settled on a property in the lakefront neighborhood of Port Dalhousie, not far from where Karla's parents lived. The death of Tammy did not stop the two from committing more heinous acts. In fact, they seemed to enjoy the thought of what they had done, and the privacy of their new home meant less risk of being caught. On the morning of April 6, 1991, Paul and Karla spotted a teenage girl rowing on a lakeshore, though other sources say she was jogging along the lake. Paul got out and snuck toward her, hiding in the bushes nearby. Karla then caught the girl's attention by waving at her from their car. When the girl was distracted, Paul rushed toward her and dragged her into the bushes, where she was raped. He then demanded she stay in the bushes for several more minutes so as to give him and Karla time to drive away. A couple months after this, on June 7th, Karla invited a friend of hers over to the Port Dalhousie home. This person is known only by the pseudonym Jane Doe. Paul was attracted to her and wanted to do to her what he had done with Tammy. She was drugged, and the two filmed themselves assaulting her. Jane Doe eventually woke up, oblivious to the fact she'd been assaulted. Paul apparently didn't feel that he had had enough of her, so in August, they invited Jane Doe back to the house where she was again drugged and raped. In this second instance, she began to vomit and had trouble breathing, leading Paul and Karla to immediately call 911. Eventually, however, they managed to revive her. After this, Jane Doe caught on to what they'd been doing to her and stopped visiting the home. The worst of the pair's assaults occurred on June 15th. It was on this night that Paul had traveled to the nearby city of Burlington, either to steal license plates or to find another victim. Meanwhile, 14-year-old Leslie Mahaffey was returning home after attending a wake for some of her classmates who had recently died in a car crash. In the preceding months, she had become increasingly rebellious, often staying out very late into the night. This led her mother to institute a strict curfew. On this particular night, Leslie was again out late and upon returning home, discovered that she had been locked out. She didn't want to ring the doorbell as she was not in the mood to be scolded by her parents. Instead, she walked to a nearby convenience store to use the payphone and call a friend and ask if she could crash at their place. After a long call, her friend convinced Leslie that she should just return home and wake her parents. So Leslie did. While walking along her street, she came across a man scoping out the neighborhood. It was Paul Bernardo. According to Paul, the two had a rather nonchalant conversation about how he was going to break into one of the houses before Leslie asked if he had any cigarettes. Paul led her back to his car, then shoved her in and sped off towards St. Catharines. After forcing Leslie into the home, Paul informed Karla that he had abducted a teenage girl. For the rest of the day, Leslie was held in captivity and was raped by both Paul and Karla. If released, she would certainly report the assault to the police, so early on June 16th, Paul grabbed an electrical cord and strangled Leslie Mahaffey to death. Her body was stored in the basement as Paul and Karla discussed how to dispose of her. They settled on the rather odd idea of dismembering Leslie and encasing her body parts in concrete. The following day, Paul got to work. With a saw, he cut up her legs, arms, head, and torso, then bought 20 bags of concrete from a nearby hardware store. Each part was placed in a box, then filled over with concrete and left to dry. Karla assisted Paul in hauling the blocks into the car. The one containing Leslie's torso was the most difficult, as it weighed a staggering 90 kilograms or 200 pounds. Eventually, all blocks were in the car, and the two drove to Lake Gibson, where the parts were dumped in a secluded area. Over the coming days, the Mahaffey family prayed that their daughter would return home soon. They asked Leslie's friends about her whereabouts, but none had an answer. They could only hope that Leslie had taken refuge in one of her friends' homes, and they were refusing to tell. Meanwhile, Paul, Karla, the Bernardos, and the Homolkas were busy planning the wedding, which was to take place in late June. It was an expensive wedding, and almost picture-perfect. Many mourned the fact that Tammy was not there to witness the occasion, and a few in attendance noticed somewhat erratic behavior in Paul and Karla, as if something more was going on underneath the surface. But it was nonetheless a momentous day. Paul and Karla were officially husband and wife. On the same day, a father and his son paid a visit to Lake Gibson to go fishing. The father noticed a number of peculiar objects peeking just above the water. He stepped into the lake to get a closer look. They were concrete blocks. Cracks had formed in them, and within those cracks, unmistakably, were body parts. The police were immediately notified of the grisly discovery. The blocks were salvaged from the lake, and they began excavating the remains. The head would prove the most valuable in identifying the body, as the victim wore braces. It wasn't long before the Mahaffey family received the devastating news that the victim was Leslie. No incidents are known to have been committed by Paul and Karla from September 1991 to March 1992. During this time, there had been some news coverage regarding the case of Terry Anderson. She was a 14-year-old who had disappeared from St. Catharines in late November 1991, and many feared she could be a victim of the same person who killed Leslie Mahaffey. By April of 1992, the hiatus was over, and Paul and Karla were ready to strike again. This was the first time that the two went out with the full intention of abducting, raping, and killing a person. Paul had set his sights on a nearby Catholic high school, where he had spotted numerous potential victims. In the afternoon, as the students were released from school, one 15-year-old girl walked down the street to her home. Her name was Kristen French. As was rehearsed, Karla got out of their car with a map and approached Kristen, ostensibly to ask for directions. While distracted, Paul snuck up from behind and dragged Kristen into the car. The two then sped away from the scene. The abduction occurred in broad daylight and was witnessed by several people, but not understanding what they were seeing, they dismissed it. Kristen never came home late, so when she failed to arrive on this occasion, her parents immediately called the police. When investigators searched the route she would have taken to get home, they discovered one of her shoes on the pavement. It had fallen off during the struggle. Meanwhile, Paul and Karla ushered Kristen inside their home. That Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, the two filmed themselves doing the same as they'd done to Leslie, with the addition of forcing Kristen to drink excessive amounts of alcohol. During the night, Paul would drug Kristen unconscious to ensure she wouldn't escape. Kristen's last recorded words to Paul were, "I don't know how your wife can stand to be around you." On the morning of Easter, April 19th, Paul tied a noose around Kristen and strangled her to death. Encasing a body in concrete had proved to not be the best disposal method, as it bought the couple only 2 weeks in the case of Leslie Mahaffey. So when disposing of Kristen's body, they went with the more straightforward method of dumping her into a ditch near a road. It probably wouldn't be long until her body was discovered, but it didn't matter. Just like Leslie, they hoped Kristen's death would soon be forgotten, and Paul and Karla will have gotten away with murder yet again. But unlike the cases of Tammy and Leslie, the disappearance of Kristen generated a large amount of news coverage.
It was 1 week ago today that St. Catherine's teen Kristen French disappeared. Today, Niagara Regional Police say they have received hundreds of calls. And as CFTO's Tom Hayes reports, one caller witnessed the suspect's car leave the area where French was believed to have been abducted.
Inspector Vince Bevan says his officers are taking up to 60 calls a minute. Meanwhile, at Holy Cross Secondary School today, students started a Green Ribbon campaign.
It's a great feeling knowing that whenever we look at our green ribbons, we think of Kristen and hope for the best.
Kristen's parents are also wearing ribbons and, like the students, have not given up hope.
They feel so strong that the same as we do, that she's still out there, and they just want to express that feeling to the public and to Kristie if she has a chance to watch.
The amount of public attention on Kristen French's case only heightened on April 30th. It was on this day that a scrapper discovered Kristen's body hidden off a deserted road. The news, of course, was tragic, but the community of St. Catherine's was not deterred in their efforts to apprehend Kristen's killer.
The Niagara Regional Police Force assembled a task force of experienced officers to investigate this crime, plus any possible connection to the murder of Leslie Mahaffey. The task force assumed the name Project Green Ribbon. This name was drawn from the Green Ribbon of Hope campaign launched at Kristen's school after her abduction.
Much of the search was predicated on the incorrect belief that her abductor drove a beige-colored Chevrolet Camaro. Throughout 1992, police conducted a sticker program where anybody seen driving a Camaro would be stopped, interviewed, searched, and have a sticker placed on their car so that they wouldn't be checked again. They went so far as to set up stations where Camaro drivers could voluntarily be checked in so they could avoid being pulled over at random. Paul and Karla were likely relieved to see that the police were in a fruitless hunt for a car they didn't own. They may have thought they'd gotten away with it, but eventually suspicion would fall on them, and as it would turn out, it wouldn't take long. On May 12th, the police arrived at the Port Dalhousie home. In their brief talk with Paul, they noticed he seemed a bit shaken at their presence, but was cordial enough for them to not deem him suspicious. As a result, the police left and pursued other suspects. Every crisis that they averted seemed to boost Paul and Karla's confidence. However, neither of them realized that their time was running out.
intense feeling of loss that I just don't have room for anger right now. Sometimes I don't think that I've really accepted the fact that she's gone. It seems like she's just away.
In July of 1992, a documentary called The Abduction of Kristen French aired on TV, increasing public awareness of the tragedy.
Good evening. I'm Dan McClain. As you have just seen, Kristen French met a tragic end sometime just before Thursday, April 30th of this year. Over the next 90 minutes, we'll present a detailed examination of one of the several abductions and murders of young women which have shocked our community in the past year.
None of this seemed to frighten Paul, who was just as ready to claim another victim as he was before. Karla, however, was getting cold feet. The fact that she had participated in these murders was taking its toll on her. Her reluctance to assist Paul in his heinous fantasies was worsened by the fact that since their marriage, he had become increasingly abusive toward her. By this point, Paul was $20,000 in debt, and his only source of income was cigarette smuggling. He was desperate to keep up the facade for the people around him, except for Karla, onto whom he released his frustrations. Paul beat her with increasing frequency, making sure not to touch her face, as doing so would make his abuse visible to others. Karla was afraid to do anything that would upset him, and she continued to convince her parents that their relationship was going smoothly. A couple days after Christmas of 1992, the couple got into one particularly nasty fight, which left Karla with bruises all over her eyes. Paul had fucked up. When Karla went back to work several days later, her coworkers repeatedly asked her how she got the bruises, to which she said that she had gotten in a car crash. This failed to convince them, however, and they called her parents. The Homolkas arrived on January 5th and forced Karla to leave Paul. She then went with her parents to the hospital, where she admitted that Paul had been beating her. Paul was arrested and charged with domestic abuse. He was shortly thereafter released on personal recognizance. In the following weeks, Karla laid low with her uncle and aunt in nearby Brampton. Meanwhile, Paul called the Homolkas numerous times and confronted them in person, demanding to know where they were hiding Karla, but they refused to tell. He drove frantically around the town, seeing if she might be at local hangout spots, but still, she was nowhere to be found. In his desperation, he recorded a rambling apology to Karla on a cassette tape.
You understand, Karla, you're everything to me. You were my whole support system. I'm nothing without you. I'm nothing. Don't worry about Tammy, don't worry about nothing. Just fucking throw me somewhere. I know I was bad at the end, but I did some honorable things. Take care of yourself, alright? You're gonna die your husband. I can't die single. I can't die with the divorce papers served on me. I'm so lonely, Gar. I'm so fucking lonely. I don't have anybody. You're still with me, aren't you? I hope you are. I hope you are. He's coming to get me now. No! The Grim Reaper's coming! No! Karla! Hey, Car!
Meanwhile, Toronto police finally went about testing the DNA samples provided by Paul in November of 1990. The results came in early February of 1993, and they confirmed that this charming young man was the Scarborough rapist. Immediately, the police began keeping a close eye on Paul. Several officers were tasked with monitoring Paul's every move, while others went to interview Karla. Karla gave the police very little, not wanting to be taken down with Paul, but in a moment of guilt, she confessed to her relatives that she and Paul had indeed been involved in the murders of Leslie and Kristen. After her confession, she was immediately placed under police surveillance as well. Upon gaining the necessary warrants, Paul Bernardo was arrested at his St. Catharines home on February 17, 1993. News of the arrest spread throughout the region quickly, and Paul was charged with the murders of Leslie Mahaffey, Kristen French, and the numerous rapes in Scarborough. Soon, the people of Canada knew the name of Karla Homolka as well, and she became increasingly wary of the outside world. She feared prison, but found some comfort in the fact that her snitching on her ex-lover could grant her a lighter sentence. Over the coming 2.5 months, the Port Dalhousie home would be turned upside down by investigators searching for any damning evidence that could link Paul and Karla to the murders. Hair and blood samples would be good, but Karla had informed the police of one holy grail: the tapes that Paul and Karla filmed when committing their crimes. Police broke through walls, doors, floors, and ceilings, all in a desperate attempt to find the elusive tapes, but by April 30th, over 2 months after Paul's arrest, they still came up dry. Then, in early May, Ken Murray, Paul's lawyer, received a call from him in which he revealed the location of the tapes. Ken went down to the house and followed the directions Paul had given. He removed a ceiling light in the second-floor bathroom, then reached about an arm's length into the attic's insulation, and there they were. Ken took the tapes home, and he was now in a bit of a dilemma. It would be the right thing to turn them over to the police, but if he did so, it would sabotage a plea deal that Karla was trying to make with Crown prosecutors. So, he chose to keep them tucked away for more than a year. Karla Homolka's trial went first, and occurred in July of 1993. Paul Bernardo's would go after, and to provide him a fair trial, the Crown mandated a complete media ban on coverage of Karla's trial so as to not contaminate a prospective jury. This was a difficult task. It wasn't hard to ban Canadian journalists from reporting on the trial, but doing so for American journalists was impossible. And so, while Canadian reporters wrote down their notes and kept them stored for later, American reporters would immediately have their stories published in the Buffalo News, the New York Times, and other newspapers. Canadians who wanted to know the juicy details in these papers would purchase them and carry them over the border. In response, Canadian border agents began arresting people and confiscating any newspapers they saw in their cars. Their efforts to control the passage of news was hampered even further by a recent invention that had been gaining popularity throughout 1993. The Internet. A number of Usenet groups had been created with the sole purpose of exchanging information about Karla Homolka's trial. The Canadian government would take down these sites only to find that, like the Hydra, others had sprouted up in their place. Despite the fiasco in regards to the media ban, Karla's trial went ahead on July 6, 1993. Thanks to a deal made with prosecutors, Karla managed to have her sentence reduced dramatically. For assisting in the killings of 3 people, she received just 12 years. The sentence was extremely unpopular.
Amid angry protest, Karla Homolka drove away with just a 12-year sentence because police didn't find crucial evidence.
Shortly after the trial, Tammy's coffin was exhumed to see if there was any evidence on her corpse that indicated she was murdered. Upon opening the casket, the police discovered the notes and the photo that Paul and Karla had snuck in there 2 years prior. In the meantime, the police learned of another victim of Paul and Karla's, Jane Doe, the person they had drugged and assaulted on 2 occasions. As the prosecutors continually found out about new crimes, as well as the tapes, it served to delay Paul Bernardo's trial for 2 more years. In September of 1994, Ken Murray dropped Paul's case and handed it over to John Rosen, a more experienced lawyer who would handle the defense for his upcoming trial.
Go step back, please. It's one of the most talked about crimes in Canadian history. 2 savage murders, a young, nice-looking husband and wife accused in the killings, and more twists and turns than anyone could have imagined. Now, the murder trial of Paul Bernardo is finally going to begin in earnest in this Toronto courthouse.
On May 1st, 1995, jury selection began and the media returned their attention to Paul Bernardo. During his 4-month-long trial, The tapes of he and Karla's crimes were played to a horrified audience. Despite the footage seemingly showing that Paul and Karla had equal involvement, they would both attempt to deflect blame for the crimes. Karla was transferred from jail to the courtroom to speak, and in her testimony, she asserted that her life was good up until she met Paul. It was Paul who forced her to go along with his depraved fantasies, and it was Paul who ultimately killed the victims, while Karla was merely an unwilling participant. Paul testified after her. He admitted to being the Scarborough rapist, as well as the abductor of Leslie and Kristen, but he claimed that he was not the killer, rather Karla was. His claims failed to convince the jury. On September 1st, 1995, Paul Bernardo was found guilty of 9 charges. In comparison to Karla, his sentence was much more befitting of the crimes, life in prison with the unlikely possibility of parole after 25 years.
People jeer Paul Bernardo, now a convicted murderer. Kill him. Kill him.
You should get rid of him. Kill him.
Public hanging. String him up.
By the time Paul Bernardo's trial concluded, the Port Dalhousie home was boarded up and decorated with graffiti. In December of 1995, the entire thing was demolished, much to the satisfaction of onlookers. Meanwhile, Karla sat in her cell at the Kingston Prison for Women, waiting to be transferred to another facility as the prison was due to close down. In 1997, she was taken to Joliet Prison and later to St. Anne-de-Plaine Institution. Her life in prison was comfortable. She had access to a computer, enjoyed birthday parties with other inmates, and pursued a psychology degree from Queen's University via correspondence. She even had access to a playpen, which led to some bizarre photos. As her release date approached, Karla practiced her French in preparation for a move to the suburbs of Montreal. You see, although she and Paul were practically household names in most of Canada, the news of their crimes had not spread widely in French-speaking Quebec. Shortly after her release, Karla and her lawyer gave a televised interview on Radio Canada.
Est-ce que vous avez peur de cette nouvelle vie qui vous attend?
Oui. Oui.
Donc vous êtes aujourd'hui, Karla Homolka, une femme vraiment libre?
Non. Non, je pense que je serai jamais vraiment libre.
Pourquoi?
À cause de ce que j'ai fait. J'aimerais aller en arrière, puis refaire les choses, mais je peux pas.
Karla lived in the Montreal area for a while. She married the brother of her lawyer, with whom she had one child. She wanted this kid to grow up without the public scrutiny, so they relocated to the French territory of Guadeloupe. That's here in the Caribbean. She eventually returned to Quebec, where she continues to live, and every so often, people catch her walking around in public. Meanwhile, Paul languishes in prison. For 18 years, he was kept in Kingston Penitentiary before being transferred to Millhaven Institution, and he's been isolated from other inmates due to being a target. In 2008, Anthony Hainmayer finally received his justice after the court determined that the rape for which he had been convicted had actually been committed by Paul. Paul admitted to this one and numerous other assaults that weren't known before, and he is suspected of many other crimes throughout Ontario. At the time of this video's making, Paul has applied for parole twice, once in 2018 and once in 2021. Both have been denied, and it is unlikely he will ever be released.
A tremendous show of support today at a fundraiser for the French and Mahaffey families. As Kate Wheeler reports, 6 years after the murder of their daughters, the legal fight to maintain the children's dignity is far from over.
The spark that ignited a community in support of the French and Mahaffey families refuses to die. Over 1,000 people came to a $2 barbecue today to help fund the upcoming Supreme Court battle aimed at preventing the public from ever seeing the graphic videotapes of Kristen, Leslie, and other victims being assaulted by Paul Bernardo and Karla Homolka.
They were successful, and on December 21st, 2001, the 6 tapes and all known copies that showed the assaults of Tammy, Leslie, Kristen, and Jane Doe were incinerated. This is probably the most notorious case of serial killing from Canada, and while Paul and Karla were not a prolific pair of killers, having murdered 3 people, they are suspected in the deaths of a few others. 22-year-old Elizabeth Bain disappeared in June of 1990 in Scarborough. Her boyfriend, Robert Baltovich, was convicted of killing her but was later exonerated. His lawyers have tried repeatedly to investigate Paul Bernardo as a suspect in her disappearance, but they were unsuccessful, and Paul himself has denied involvement. 14-year-old Terry Anderson disappeared in November of 1991. Her body was found lying in a lake in May of 1992, not long after Kristen French's death. Investigators concluded she had drowned, but this did little to dissuade the public from thinking she was a victim of the same killer as Leslie and Kristen. As far as I can tell, Paul has neither confirmed nor denied involvement. Shortly after Paul's arrest, his official name changed from Paul Bernardo to Paul Teal. He and Karla had applied to have their surnames changed to Teal. They lifted this name from the antagonist of the 1988 film Criminal Law, Martin Teal, though the names are spelled differently. It could be speculated that Paul was trying to model himself off of that character, who was a serial killer, similar to how some believe he had modeled himself after the character Patrick Bateman from the 1991 book American Psycho. That book was found to be in Karla's possession upon her arrest, and was even brought up at Paul's trial.
The whole purpose of any interview is just stupid, because if I'm this crazy liar, I'll be just sitting here lying to you about everything, right? Right? I mean, why wouldn't I? I'm just this crazy liar.
In June of 2007, after Paul admitted to committing several additional assaults in Scarborough, he was interviewed in Kingston Penitentiary. This interview can be viewed in full on YouTube, and there have been a number of videos dissecting and analyzing Paul's behavior throughout. If this type of content is your thing, I have put links in the description to these videos.